The North American continent was no stranger to conflict. Not even 20 years before the breakout of the American Revolution, there was a massive war on the continent. The same war that saw France lose Quebec and that sowed the seeds of rebellion in the colonies. The 7 Years' War, as it's known internationally, or the French and Indian War as it's known here in the States, was the culmination of a geopolitical rivalry between Great Britain and France. The two nations have fought many different wars over the many different centuries, dating back to the Norman conquest of the island. While the two had fought devastating conflicts in the past, the 7 Years' War was truly on a different level in terms of scale and destruction. British and French troops fought each other all over the world, and the final peace saw the British cement itself as the preeminent power on the world stage. France lost most of its possessions in the New World and India, firmly landing it in a secondary power role. The loss of territory, prestige, and economic revenue spurred the French towards the British, and there was indeed a deeply held desire for revenge. This was the context of the country when Benjamin Franklin made his trip to the country to seek help for the revolution. While to many, Benjamin Franklin might have seemed like an interesting choice, to say the least, to be the ambassador to France, he was chosen for the job because of his reputation as somewhat of a Renaissance man. Among other things, Franklin was known as a writer, scientist, political philosopher, and inventor. Importantly for the Revolution, Franklin helped to write the Declaration of Independence and sign the document as well. He was very much one of the faces of the Revolution, and the face abroad. His noteworthiness made him the best ambassador to France that could have been chosen from the likely candidates. When he arrived in France, Franklin immediately began to court the nobility and argue the American side. He used his persona and reputation to gain the respect of the French upper class. Eventually, Franklin gained the attention of King Louis XVI. Over the next few months, Franklin argued first that the American Revolution was the fulfillment of the Enlightenment ways of thinking. The Enlightenment had spread through the French aristocracy and court. Many of them said that they believed in it, but the reality is that it was really just to be trendy, to be in touch with how the common people thought. I hope you could tell that I said that with the biggest eye roll in existence. Regardless of how insincere the beliefs of the aristocracy were, Franklin's appeals worked. The French, slowly but surely, began to not only feel sympathetic, but also began to advocate for helping the Americans in their struggle. The king and his ministers, though, were harder to sell. While they held the same beliefs in the Enlightenment, France had just lost a war to the British less than 20 years ago, loss that saw them give up most of their worldwide empire and a loss that they had just been recovering from financially. Initially, the French agreed to send munitions, weapons, and supplies to the rebels, but refused to send actual troops or naval assistance. Simply put, France wanted plausible deniability and did not want to get involved in another long war with the British. Franklin continued to push, though, and wrote back to the Continental Congress that the French would consider intervening officially on the American side if they could prove that they could defeat the British in open battle. At the moment, Washington had just defeated the British forces in New Jersey, but had stopped campaigning for the winter. While the victories in Trenton and Princeton were important for the war effort and probably saved the nation, the absolute failure to defend New York hung heavy over the minds of the French and other European leaders. This success finally occurred when news reached France that General Horatio Gates had not only defeated John Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, but had utterly destroyed it. This single moment changed everything. King Louis XVI summoned Franklin and informed him that the Kingdom of France would be declaring war on Great Britain. Within a few months, the French Navy began moving troops over the Atlantic. The Royal Navy suddenly had to worry about more than just small groups of American raiders and sloops. The scales on both the ocean and land were now much more balanced. Franklin was not done, though. things were about to get even worse for the British. France wasn't the only country that he was convincing to join the war. In March of 1777, the Spanish also began to smuggle weapons and supplies to the Americas through the port of New Orleans, which was then part of Spanish America. Later that year, John Jay, a rising star in American politics, was assigned to the Continental Congress to be their ambassador to the Spanish court. It was his job to convince the Spanish to officially enter the war. While Spain was technically on the losing side of the 7 Years' War, they gained control of the former French territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for giving up Florida to the British. Spain also gave up Gibraltar at the extreme southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. So while not as bad as France, Spain was still very bitter towards the British. Franklin sent letters to the Spanish, encouraging them to join the war on the side of the colonies. After much discussion, the Spanish decided to join the war, except not as allies of the Americans. Instead, they would be co-belligerents, fighting alongside the French against the British. While in reality, the Spanish were now fighting alongside the Americans, even providing them with more munitions and supplies. This distinction of being a co-belligerent instead of being an ally is important and gives us an insight into the strategic goal of the European powers in this war. Both the Spanish and the French believed that by getting involved in the war, they would do three things. First, weaken British power across the world. Second, the return of their previously lost territories, lost during the 7 Years' War. And third, they wanted to be able to prevent a newly independent American state from being too powerful. To them, it was important to have a moderately powerful state that they could trade with and be a geopolitical counterweight to British influence in North America. But they also foresaw that a truly massive American state could become a geopolitical powerhouse, much the same as the European powers. And in hindsight, this revelation was almost prophetic. Spain was especially concerned with this given the fact that they controlled vast territories in the New World, an immensely powerful American state with a center of gravity across the Atlantic, in whatever form that might be, could threaten Spanish dominance, where they extracted most of their wealth. These concerns made it important that when the time came for negotiations, the French and the Spanish needed to be seen as the leader of the warring faction, so that way they could dictate the peace that was to come. Because of Benjamin Franklin's masterstroke of diplomacy, by 1779, the British Empire was now at war, not just on the North American continent with its rebelling colonies, but with two worldwide empires. Not only had the American Revolution ballooned in size, but also in expanse. For the war to continue, the British would need a knockout blow somewhere. It was decided by the British military command that this knockout blow would take place in the rebelling colonies. Word was sent to begin mobilizing the British soldiers overseas and to take a fight to a new theater. The British would strike south.